Morning, good afternoon, folks. This is Max with the Rbla Foundation. We're going to get started soon here. We're still waiting for some people to sign in, so just want to let you know you're in the right place, and we'll be getting started momentarily. Hey folks, this is Max with RDLA and Rbla. We're going to get started in about 2 or 3 minutes here, so just bear with us and we'll be starting shortly. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Max Bronstein with the Rbla Foundation. I'm also wearing my RDLA hat today. Very happy to be moderating today's webinar because we actually have quite a few people on the line, which is excellent. And we also have a very packed agenda today. So go to the next slide, please. So first we'll be hearing a little bit about what's going on in the world of kind of funding and appropriations, and very happy to have an update from Research America there. And then we'll hear more about sort of what NIH is actually doing with those dollars and looking at how those funds are actually being spent in the rare and orphan disease space. And then we'll be hearing a little bit about what's kind of been going on with right to try and compassionate use issues, which has certainly been a hot topic, not only legislatively but in the media. And then for those, many of you probably are aware that Congress is now marking up PDUFA legislation, which is the legislation that helps keep the FDA on track and funded. So we'll hear about how efforts are going on that front. I'll be providing an update toward the end of the call about the state of play around the OPEN Act, which I know many of the patient orgs on the call have signed on to, and then we'll close and hear a little bit about what's happening with our events at the foundation, and that RDLA is running in particular events with Rare on the Road and in-district lobby days. So those will be coming up towards the end of the call. So why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide, and we can turn it over to Rachel from Research America, who's going to give an update on NIH and funding with those agencies. Rachel.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to speak with you all today. Next slide. So first things first, we have a little bit of a celebration. FY17 passed amazingly. It was about 7 months late, but that's okay. With a $2 billion increase for NIH, which is about a 6% increase. One little caveat is that the cures funding is included in that $2 billion increase. So it's still $2 billion, but it's inclusive of cures. And that gets us to about where we were in 2011, 2012. Next slide. So we're definitely in the right direction. This is the second year that we have had a $2 billion increase. And now looking forward, next slide. This is where we hope to go. So we are once again going to be requesting a $2 billion increase in FY18, and we hope that everyone will join us in that ask. Our champions have been really vocal about saying we want a $2 billion increase year after year after year. We want to create a new pattern, and we completely endorse that idea, and we think that that's really where we should be going. Next slide. On the FDA front, so Fda Appropriations are a little bit different from NIH because the FDA budget is made up of budget authority, which is from the federal government, and user fees. And user fees you're going to hear about a little bit later on from Eric, I believe, who's going to go over PDUFA, MEDUFA, all the UFA reauthorization. So that makes up about 41% of the budget. The federally funded part did get a nice increase. Next slide. Next slide. And it got a great increase, and we're going to keep going in that direction. Our ask next year for the budget authority is going to be $2.8 billion. So this is all great. This is all lovely. We're going in the right direction. We are seeing some really great investments in research. But looking ahead, it's a little bit more difficult. Next slide. So for any of you guys keeping score at home, we have about 4.5 months until the end of this fiscal year. And that gives us about 50 to 60 legislative days, depending on the chamber that you're looking at. And that's not a lot of time to pass 12 bills. Everyone in Congress seems really committed to doing regular order. But just for anyone who can remember back this far, the last regular order was actually in 1994, when all appropriations bills were passed one at a time before the end of the fiscal year. So regular order isn't really all that regular anymore, especially when we have 4.5 months to go. And kind of a really not a great environment for policymaking. So despite the best efforts, it looks like that's not going to be we're not going to be seeing new FY18 bills in October. Next slide. And I hate to be all doom and gloom, but on top of that, sequestration is back. So sequestration is places artificial caps on spending. And this is, the point of this was to keep federal spending under control and to reduce deficit. And this year, in FY18, we're going to be about $3 billion below what the caps were last year. And the graph on the bottom is inflation-adjusted dollars. So you'll see that it doesn't say $3 billion in the graph, but in real dollars, it's going to be about a $3 billion decrease. And then on top of all of that, President Trump has suggested that we stay even below the caps, and we actually bring our NDD spending down to $462 billion. Next slide. So I'm sure you've all had a chance to check out the President's skinny budget. So there wasn't a ton of details on FDA other than some notes about user fees. So I'm not going to really go into very much about that. Hopefully we'll find out more next week when the President releases his full budget. But for NIH, we saw some really troubling things. We saw a massive cut to NIH, about 20%. We see the elimination of the Fogarty International Center. We see potential cuts to indirect costs. And we see, quote-unquote, unspecified structural changes. And this is really concerning to us because oftentimes when we're talking about restructuring and consolidating and kind of moving things around, we have to be really aware of kind of not letting rare diseases get left out of this restructuring. This won't be kind of the first time that we're looking at, ideas that we should prioritize based on burden, or we should prioritize based on, prevalence. And it's really important to recognize that, one, the easiest way to come to burden is prevalence, but that's not an accurate representation of burden at all. And two, external prioritization of research doesn't make sense. Science should be driving science. Breakthroughs should be driving breakthroughs. And oftentimes you find breakthroughs when you're not looking. And we see that time and time again in rare disease research when, not only are you unlocking discoveries about a specific rare disease, you now know something new about arthritis. You now know something new about Alzheimer's. And so it's really important to continue research in all these different avenues. And so any kind of talk of consolidating, prioritizing, is something that Research America is really keeping an eye on. Next slide. So I'm not sure if you saw this quote from Director Mulvaney, but it's really clear that we as advocates have some work to do with the administration for them to really understand that NIH isn't, shouldn't ever be a backseat. It should never be secondary. It's part of our national defense. It's part of keeping Americans healthy and safe and prosperous, and it contributes to the economy, just as much as defense. And so we really need to kind of work as advocates to convey the importance to our community and to our health and to our safety. And so now I'm going to stop being all doom and gloom, and I'm going to go to our silver lining. Next slide. And that's that we have some really amazing champions in Congress. When they saw these proposed cuts, they flat out said no, that's not happening. And the two people who are chairs of the committees that oversee NIH funding flat out said that's not happening. And then they turned around and they had a $2 billion increase in FY17. So it's clear that we have people fighting for us, and we need to continue to support them and thank them and continue on these efforts. Next slide. And just a couple other responses. And it's clear that Congress gets it, and we just need to do a little bit more work kind of demonstrating the importance of research to the administration. And I think I'm going to leave it at that for questions. Is that, yep.
Anyone have any questions? I just have a question or comment. Senator Heller was just visiting his office, and I think he made kind of a disturbing statement when he said that they were going to go for a, basically a prioritization of 10 diseases, fund those diseases, fund the research, and cut a whole lot of other pre-existing conditions, which would leave out the rare disease community. It leaves out the disease community that, the part that we're talking about. It is not a good idea. I'm afraid we're going to have to really work on that. And I obviously the ones that are most common, that most people know about, are cancer or heart disease. That's all what we're talking about. We're talking about systemic diseases that are very complex and that we don't have answers for right now. So I just want you to know that that was like, I don't think that's going down the right path. Right? But that's where some of this is going right now. And he did say one other thing, though, that you didn't mention. I know that he said did not pay any attention to the president's budget because we're going to do exactly what we want. That's how we do it. So that was kind of a, I mean, that was an uplifting statement. They're basically going to be looking at this and doing what they think is right. We just have to let them see where that taking 10 diseases is not going to be the answer.
And in that context, to be specific, it was a group of 10 to 12 Republican senators, and that was what they're discussing for compromise to the greater. That's how they envision getting it passed, is to prioritize 10 diseases in order to get it passed with Republicans.
Any other questions, comments? Max, are there any comments from the other people on the webinar?
One question. So I do believe about, there was a high-level meeting at the White House with Dr. Collins and other folks kind of in the biomedical research community. I'm curious, Rachel, if you guys got any sense of, how that meeting together and what the impact was of that meeting, and what can we as advocates take away from that meeting and ideally build on in our own advocacy?
Yeah, so there was a meeting, and it brought together a lot of industry groups, patient groups, all the stakeholders that care about NIH. And from our understanding, everyone was really on message. They had a pre-meeting before the meeting to make sure that everyone was on the same page. And every single person around the table stressed the importance of NIH and that underfunding NIH would be detrimental to our health, to our economy, and to future health. And Trump was not at that the entire meeting. I believe it was attended by Ivanka and Jared Kushner and Secretary Price and Director Collins, and then they gave a recap at the end to President Trump. We kind of took that as the administration looking again at their skinny budget, that maybe that wasn't the right path to go down, and reassessing how they wanted to deal with NIH in the skinny budget, in the full budget. Right now, actually, as we speak, there's an appropriation hearing with Director Collins and a couple of the other institute directors. So hopefully after this hearing, we'll have a little bit more of an idea where the administration's thinking on NIH is, kind of in a more official way. But that meeting was definitely a good sign to us that they care and they're bringing people to the table and they're listening.
Great, thank you for that. Definitely, we have our work cut out for us with the administration, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do in their next budget iteration here. So, thank you very much, Rachel, for joining us, and thank you so much for being on the call today. Really appreciate you joining these critical updates. I want to move on to our next speaker now, Dr. Nale, who I'm hopefully pronouncing your last name correctly, but
that's great.
Great. So
thank you, Max. Thank you so much. And I echo what Mrs. Whitmore said, our friend from Nevada, that there is no disease with better and higher moral latitude than another disease. So every life matters and everyone matters. So thank you, RDLA and Every Life Foundation, for hosting us. This is a rare occasion for us too in the ME/CFS disease space, because Carol, our president, is here from SMCI. We have the head of the foundation from Nevada as well, Mrs. Whitmore, Brian Vestack, and ME Action, Beth Mazur, co-founder, is here. So you have all of us here in one room. We hardly can do that on our own. So thank you for doing that to us. Max, if I can go back to the first slide, this is one of the most disenfranchised and neglected diseases. In that sense, it is a prototype for rare diseases. It's the mysterious illness that science has yet to unravel. These are not my words. These are the words of Francis Collins, the director of the National Institute of Health. We work at an organization called Solve MECFS Initiative based in Los Angeles. Please visit us when you are there. We are exclusively dedicated to chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis. Next, Max. We have a formidable board of directors, but also an outstanding group, our scientific and research advisory group. There are many figures. I'm going to zip through very quickly today because this is the time is short, so forgive me for rushing this. Many of the leading experts really in the MECFS space, visionary, who are helping us thinking about the science and the policy of this disease. We even have a star, Morgan Fairchild, with us as well. She's a policy wonk, and she is on our research advisory council. Next. This is a brief epidemiology, if we can call it this way. This is a disease that's not, its etiology is not unknown, but it is estimated, according to the Institute of Medicine and the CDC, that up to 2.5 million in the United States have that disease. It affects more women than men, 25%. Again, think about that number, 25% of patients at one point in time, they become housebound or bedbound. MECFS can happen to anyone. In fact, we have young children and adolescents as part of the group. The average age is around 33. 91% of patients, again, think about that number, 91% are undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. I mean, this is what we are dealing with here. The cause, the etiology, the molecular basis are unknown, and there are no FDA-approved drugs, and we have very poor grasp of the natural history of the disease. We'll talk about this in a second. Next. Many challenges we have in the MECFS space, similar to all the challenges that we confront in the rare disease space. We have challenges in the misinformation and antagonism about the disease, even from the medical community sometimes. We have challenges with the lack of critical mass of researchers. We have insignificant funding for research. These are two related, like Rachel just mentioned. We have several diagnostic criteria. We have elusive etiologies. We have lack of FDA-approved drugs, absent pharma investment, insurance, and ICD coding. These are, essential for billing and for insurance reasons. We have hard career paths for researchers and no feasible biomarkers right now. We have a poor grasp of the natural history of the disease, which is the basic, most elementary stepping stone to studying a disease of sorts. And we have minimal patient support, if no patient support. Now, to me, the cardinal problem really is the severe knowledge gap. I argue that if we understand the clinical and molecular basis of this disease, many of these problems on the left here will go away, or we will be mitigated. And I am illustrating this with a point here. This is a graphic showing 4 terrible diseases: autism, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, and MECFS. Number of publications as a function of time. And Rachel, this is to your point that you were making before. And as you can see, the flat line down below is the MECFS. We have no particular understanding as reflected by the number of publications out there. And that is what I call the knowledge gap, and that is correlating naturally with the reduced investment and spending on the disease space. It's very low, you won't see it, but it's at the bottom of how much the NIH spends on a disease like MECFS. Next. Again, we are going very quickly here. So that we have a shortage in all areas, in the 3 essential domains, investigation domains in this disease space. That includes the descriptive, the mechanistic, and the therapeutic. Again, without mentioning too much about each of these disease space, we have a lot of work to do. But even on the descriptive aspect of a disease, which is the most elementary, we still have a lot of things to do. In fact, the Institute of Medicine report came out 2 years ago and said the committee was unable to define subgroups of patients, or even to clarify, this is a code, to define the natural history of the disease, which means the onset, the duration, the severity, the recovery, the functional deficit, the comorbidity, the demographics. This is the basic, most elementary understanding of a disease that affects. So this is, again, part of the problem. I'm not going to be negative throughout the talk, but I want to describe to this group, this formidable group, that we are in a very difficult position, and we need all the help we can get. Next. Next. Now, I'm describing to you now 3 myths about this disease because they also illustrate our plight. The first myth is your blood test came back normal. That's what the physicians tell you, right? Some of them who are not familiar with this disease. And I say, you know, what you measured in my blood came back normal. It's very different, completely different. When we use standard testing for certain batteries that are approved for other diseases, it's very different. And next, in fact, let me illustrate with an example. This is a result of a metabolomics analysis from blood that we have done on patients, and others have done the same thing too. Without going into much details, and you don't have to be a scientist to read this graph, this is what we call a heat map. It's comparing ME/CFS patients with healthy controls, and up and down, higher or lower, this is maybe hundreds of products in blood. It's either red or blue. So you can see there are extremes on this heat map, red or blue. This means there are lots of targets. There are lots of differences in blood from ME/CFS patients. So the blood is not normal. Right? That's the first myth. This next myth. The second myth is that you look normal. People tell you look normal. Many of our patients who have very serious chronic diseases also look normal. But again, we rely on data in debunking these myths. Now, if you look here at this standardized test, which is the health quality test that is given in all the hospitals in different countries, all countries, ME/CFS ranked up top here. It ranks the lowest in scoring of the quality of life, even more than the diabetes or other chronic diseases, so even more than cancer. So there's nothing normal about this. Next. But this is the big whopper here. This is what the misinformation out there is that this is caused by depression, or it's in your head. And I, as a scientist, tried so hard to look objectively at this. Right? And if there is a disease that is screaming at you that this is not a disease of depression, it's this one, as a primary reason. Now, the secondary depression is also common to all diseases. We all know that. But as a primary reason, in depression and anxiety, we have increased cholesterol, increased cortisol level. Here we have reduced cortisol level. We have enlarged adrenal gland in depression and anxiety. Here we have reduced. We have reduced the serotonin levels in.
So for times we switch to policy solution?
I wish I had the policy solution.
You're telling the story of the whole rare disease community
sure.
here. So,
exactly, great.
Yeah.
So keep moving, Max. So here, this brings me back to my childhood, but that's how I think about policy and science. No matter how high our ladder is, how tall our ladder is, if we are confronted with myopic policies, we are going to go back to square one. Right? We're going to have shoots and what we are trying to do here, Julia, in the disease space is to build more ladders, right, and to reduce the shoots, right. And these are a combination of science and these are general and also applicable to the disease space. Now let's move back to the next in the interest of time. Next, Max. Now, one more. So the challenges persist as I was describing, but there are a series of differences and changes that has happened over the last 2 years. And I took the liberty of kind of chronicle them here in terms of what are the policy changes that have happened recently. And that started with an Institute of Medicine report released 2 years ago that kind of triggered changes at the NIH, including a decision from the NIH director to bolster this or studies on this disease. They established an intramural study here it's shown in that chronicle at the left corner, intramural study at the NIH. In fact, Brian just participated as a patient in one of those studies. And then they created supplemental. All of these are policy implementation changes at the NIH, small in size, but important. And also for the first time, we are working with the NIH and others to establish a common data element program for this disease for the first time in the history of the disease. That is to normalize and standardize all criteria so at least data can be compared to each other, and data can be collected in a way that can be eventually compared to each other. And the most recent event in terms of the policy changes is working on this consortium for data management as well as for collaborative centers at the NIH. All of these are policy changes that, again, we are not, we're zipping through very quickly. And that came as a result of pressure from the patient community. And Brian has been also leading the charge on this, and that, as well as their families and organizations like us and others. And there are many interested now academic centers that we are trying to do as a matter of policy, implementing MECFS programs within these centers, from Cornell to Stanford to Brigham and Women to other major centers, to institutionalize, so to speak, the MECFS flight at these centers. So next. Now these are, again, Julia, I'm going to wrap up soon here, but this is, these are some examples of these challenges I gave you before and some solutions for each one. And so examples of solutions that we are, again, as a small organization trying to implement as a part of a collective group, as a collective effort with our advocates and other organization friends. Let me give you an example. A lack of critical mass of researchers. We now fund research ourselves, for example, to through seed grants to bring investigators and retain talent into the field, as well as making investments at medical centers to do so. That's one of one solutions, as well as working with the NIH on their big scale agenda and centers. Again, I'm butchering this very quickly, but let me, I know you are looking at me, so let me move forward with the one more slide, Max. So to me, that's what I call the MECFS iceberg, really. It's, we know it's there. We can only see the surface, above the surface. And there is so much underneath the surface to explore and to learn. And we need your help and the help of everybody here in this great community to, I have a few slides later that show how you can help us, but then we're going to stop here and maybe we can do questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
And let me just add to that. Thank you for the time. This disease has been known for 30 years as chronic fatigue syndrome, and we can barely utter those words and get them out of our mouth because it completely underrepresents the pain and severity of this disease. So when we talk about MECFS, we call it myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is it's very difficult to say, but it does sound like a serious disease, which really does describe it more appropriately.
I have a question. What support do you get from the Congressional Caucus on Rare Disease?
We are relatively new, and you may have comment about this as well. We are relatively new to really developing an advocacy program with Congress. So to date, we have not engaged there. It doesn't mean that we can't get there when we begin. Yeah.
And because technically it's not, in terms of numbers and propensity, it's not a rare disease, the MCAS, and we have, collaborations with them, but not, technically it doesn't follow that definition, but.
We're sort of the animal disease that fits nowhere. I mean, one of our challenges forever is that among the 37 institutes at the NIH, there was no one because so little is understood about the disease, there's no one institute in which we fit. And that has continued to be a very difficult problem.
Max, do you have any questions on the webinar?
Nope, all good. I think we're ready for our next speaker, if you guys are as well on your end.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Nally, for that presentation.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being on the call today. Really, if you keep the line on your end. And Allison, you should be unmuted now. Are you there?
I'm here. Hello.
We'll be happy to run the slides for you on our end, so feel free to take it away.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I will not overstay my welcome, I hope, and we'll go through this quickly. Next slide, please. This is just a required disclosure saying that I work with several pharmaceutical companies to help them decide who to give access to drugs to. So, all right, so on this case, I imagine many of you on the call are familiar with the name Josh Hardy. Some of you on the call actually were involved in this case. And this was a case that happened, I believe, in 2014 or thereabouts, in which a child who was in ICU dying of something that's not actually a rare disease, adenovirus infection, but due to his immune system system deficiencies, he was not able to defeat this common virus. And the patient advocacy community stepped forward and lobbied hard and ferociously to get access to an investigational antiviral drug to help Josh. And this sort of well, I'll leave it for you to decide if it went off the tracks or not, but as you can see from this first slide here, in a short period of time, it spiraled into the Chimerix, which was the drug company CEO, facing death threats over his unwillingness to provide the drug via what we call compassionate use. Next slide. And so what actually happened is the FDA stepped forward and said, let's go ahead and make a clinical trial to get access to not only this child, but other children who also have the same infection. So it was considered a victory by some, accounts in that Josh did get the drug he wanted, but it was not a compassionate use victory. It was the way that most patients get access to investigational medicines via clinical trials. And as you can see from the headlines here, in his case, it seemed to work. He ended up leaving the ICU. The adenovirus infection was overcome, although he did end up passing away several years later of his underlying illness. And as you can see, the trial continued, but it did not prove positive. So the reason that I want to flag this case for you, and though many of you may be familiar with it, is in this case, there was a patient seeking access to an investigational drug to save his life. And in this case, the investigational drug did seem to save his life. Again, it was not accessed via compassionate use. It was accessed via a clinical trial, but for the individual, it worked. However, the end results were not anything that's going to be helping a population. They're actually redoing the trial to try to see if they can screen out some possibilities and get a definitive answer as to whether adenovirus will help with, brincidofovir will help with adenovirus or not. So it's sort of a mixed bag. Next slide. What was not a mixed bag was the pharmaceutical industry's reaction to this case, which was to become highly alarmed about, quote-unquote, activists, patient advocates, and the particularly social media campaigns and their potential to, be disruptive in the way it was for Chimerix. And so I am not in industry. I'm an academic bioethicist, but our group decided that this was something where bioethics may actually be able to be of use to industry. We set up the group that was on the last slide, and we have been greeted with open arms by industry who say that this is a very complex area and they want guidance. One of the things we did, as you can see on the slide here, we launched something called Compact, which actually works with J&J on a individual patient level decision. When they get requests for drugs, we help them decide. I'm not talking about that here. Instead, if you go to the next slide, I want to talk about what we did, broadly speaking, in the area of what is known alternately as expanded access, compassionate use, and pre-approval access. And what we did is we reached out to all the various groups on the page here to find out, what were their issues in this area, where did they encounter problems, where did they encounter successes, what were they concerned about, et cetera. And in the process of doing that, next slide, we encountered numerous myths, including ones that we just debunked very recently. If you talk to the drug companies, the most common things that you heard from them about why they were not willing to give access to an investigational drug to a patient was that, these are very sick patients. That's why they're reaching out for compassionate use access instead of going into a clinical trial. And because they're very sick patients, they're more likely than the people in clinical trials to have a serious adverse event, even if it has nothing to do with the drug. It's just, sick people have things happen to them. And the industry was concerned that if they had a serious adverse event in a patient who was getting their investigational drug through pre-approval access or compassionate use, they would either end up with the FDA putting a clinical hold on their trials, thereby slowing down and potentially halting the entire development of the product, or when it was time for the FDA to potentially approve the product, this particular serious adverse event in a patient would come back and haunt you. We heard that, I can't even tell you how many times I heard that. And we actually went to the FDA and said, here is what we've heard repeatedly. Could you please do an audit and see if this is true or not? And both of these have been debunked in papers the FDA just published recently. So what we've been trying to do is, again, go to all the stakeholders, find out, where the various issues are, and then see if there's anything we can do to help. Next slide. One of the most basic things we can do, you can go all the way through this one, is just pull up everything on the page at the same time. One of the most basic things we can do is educate people about, educate people about what compassionate use expanded access is and how you access drugs, because it turns out that this is A, not common knowledge, B, not standard from company to company, and C, it's something that doctors are never trained in. Some doctors figure it out along the way and then sort of, hold the hand of others that they know to help them through, but it's not something that you are ever taught, and as a result, there are lots of confusions and misperceptions about it, including on the part of the patient providers. So basically what we've been trying to do is to educate patient advocacy groups, legislators, drug company officials, physicians, et cetera, saying, look, there's an orderly stream of events that happens here. Everything is contingent on the thing before it. First, you have to find a physician who's willing to help you try to get access to an investigational drug. Then you have to find the drug that you're interested in. You have to be able to identify something. You can't just say, I want a drug. You have to identify who makes that drug that you're interested in and how to contact the company to request access to that drug. Once that the company gets that request, it's in the company's hands, and really the company can take a long time to respond. It can never respond. There's no real, standard there for what the company needs to do. But if the company responds and says, yes, we're willing to give our product, then the physician, along with the company, needs to contact the FDA to complete a form. The FDA reviews the form and either allows the proposal to proceed or not, and we know that over 99% of the time the FDA does allow it to proceed. And then next, the physician has to actually get IRB approval at the institution where the drug will be used. Anytime you're using an investigational drug on somebody, it has to go through the IRB for review. And then last but not least, once the drug is used, any serious or unexpected adverse events have to be reported back to the FDA. So just trying to get that chain of events and sort of, the timeline of things out and about has actually proved to be one of our huge challenges, and we would love to be able to help you pass that on to your communities if you're interested. Next slide. One of the things that we did, this goes back to what I was saying about there not being any real standards for what the drug company had to do, is we worked with legislators on a provision in 21st Century Cures Act that actually requires at a certain point in the drug development process for companies to have to make public their policies about, when and where they would be willing to make compassionate use access available, contact info so you know how to contact the company and are not, sitting there trying to chase phone numbers or email addresses that may lead to dead ends. Information about what sort of medical information or whatnot you need to provide up front for the request, and also how long it's going to take to hear back. Now, what we intended that to be was how long for you to hear back with an actual answer to your question. Unfortunately, companies seem to be interpreted that to how long they need to, how long they are allowed to take before they acknowledge your request, which is not the same thing as delivering an answer. So unfortunately, that did not work out exactly as desired, but we have seen a dramatic increase in companies putting their policies publicly available on their websites, which will help patients. Next slide. But still, the fact remains that in order to request pre-approval access from a pharmaceutical company, you either need knowledgeable doctors or, perhaps a patient advocacy organization or something else that can help you identify that promising drug, and then you need to learn how to request that particular drug. So the FDA is actually working right now on creating a navigator that will help with part 2 of this. Once you know what the drug is, you can go into the navigator to find out, what's the phone number, what's the email address, what's the way to contact and request the drug. But there's still a problem with number 1. We still need, your average run-of-the-mill physician, unless they're involved in clinical trials or unless they're really up-to-date in their particular area, don't necessarily know what's in the pipeline. And so when they have a request from a patient who says, doctor, isn't there anything else out there that we can try? And, nothing seems to be working. Is there anything new that we can try? I'm willing to try anything. Physicians, many, know what's in the development pipeline, but there are also others who don't, and we want to try to even the playing field with regard to that, because not everybody has access to those expert, knowledgeable physicians. Next slide. Other problems that exist is, as I said, the last step is that these serious adverse events are supposed to get reported to the FDA, and that is so the FDA knows what's happening with these new investigational drugs that they're going to need to be approving at some point down the road, but B, so when the next compassionate use request comes along, the FDA has that, little kernel of knowledge about what happened to work from. And we know from the FDA that these SAEs are not being reported. And the FDA says it doesn't have the funding or the person power to be able to go out and audit or track these things down. So that's an area where we need to work on. There's also a question of, rather this being a one-off, attempt to help a patient like it was with Josh Hardy, is there something we can learn from these individual patients or even from groups of patients that would actually go towards helping the patients as a whole, helping the development of the drug, or helping, collect data when it comes time for that FDA approval? We talk a lot about real-world data. Is there something we can do in making compassionate use access to people that would help with real-world data about understanding how these drugs work or don't work for particular diseases? Also, how do you gin up excitement about investors when you talk about breakthroughs and new policy, new approaches and dramatic findings, et cetera? But at the same time, patients read those reports, and then they really do expect that these unapproved drugs are going to be miracle cures, which unfortunately we know more often than not they're not going to be. So is there some way that we can talk to different audiences simultaneously and speak to those audiences without over-promising to patients? And then finally, the very small companies, when you talk to them about pre-approval access, they commonly say, we just can't afford to do it. We have barely enough drug to do the clinical trials. We don't have enough people to run an extra, sort of tracking program, et cetera. So just financial issues there. Next slide. One thing that I can...
We're running very low on time, but I wanted to make sure that folks hear about Right to Try. So I know that
that's it right here.
Great, thank you.
So what I can assure you is that the FDA is not an obstacle to patients obtaining access to drugs. We have heard that repeatedly. We've investigated it thoroughly, and we cannot find any evidence to support that. Next slide. As I said earlier, the FDA permits 99% of these requests to proceed. Next slide. We actually worked with them in 2016 to streamline the application for individual patients. It's now only 7 questions and can be answered in about 45 minutes, so that should make things easier. Next slide. Despite the fact that we can find no evidence that the FDA is the limiting factor, there continues to be this myth that it is the limiting factor, and that's really what's pushing the right to try laws that Max just mentioned. The idea is that in order to help patients, you need to get the FDA out of the way. The FDA is an insurmountable obstacle. So there are actually these pending federal initiatives on your screen right now that create an alternative pathway and say, in contrast to the pathway I talked about earlier, next slide, where, you move systematically one step through the other with the FDA sort of in the middle. Next slide. Right to Try proposes a streamlined, you can go all the way through this slide, a streamlined system in which you just cut out FDA. So, you know, you still have to find the physician, you still have to find the drug, you still have to contact the company, you still have to ask permission for the drug, and you may still have to seek IRB approval at the institution. We're not really sure about that. It seems somewhat convoluted in the laws. Next slide. So the positive aspect of right to try is that it's definitely simpler. We're not positive that it's faster, simply because the FDA component was not a holdup. In emergency situations, the FDA, you know, consistently gives an answer within 24 hours, and in non-emergency, the average is 4-day turnaround. So, you know, when you talk about people who wait months and months for access to drug, the holdup is normally on the side of waiting to hear back from the companies, and so right to try doesn't do anything about that. So that's why I say right to try is simpler, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's faster. Next slide. And in contrast to this positive aspect of right to try, which is that it's simpler, there's a whole host of negative aspects. So first off, all the right to try laws so far have been state laws. I think currently 35 states have passed these laws, but you know, state laws don't typically govern access to investigational drugs. That's a federal thing. So thus far, nobody has really been receiving access to these drugs simply because we're in this sort of jurisdictional netherland. We can talk more about that during the Q&A if you want. But the state laws that are out there are inconsistent. They make this really unclear patchwork, and the federal bills that have been proposed will not fix that. So lack of clarity, as I was saying about, you know, what exactly these laws mean and how they work. And typically when there's a lack of clarity, companies or hospitals just say, you know what, we're not going to get involved. So we actually fear that there's going to be less access to investigational drugs. And I've already talked about the importance of the FDA, so of course the FDA is cut back here. Next slide. So the takeaway is that in our analysis, right to try uses patient-friendly language, but few or possibly none of its benefits will help patients, and that the true intent of the legislation is to downsize government and limit FDA authority. So that's it for me. I'm happy to entertain any questions you have.
Thanks so much, Allison. Really appreciate that update. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for questions because we still have many more speakers.
Okay, well, my address is on the screen. Anyone should feel free to jot it down and contact me if they wish.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Allison.
Okay, I'll talk to you later.
Yep, thanks. So, yeah, our next speaker, we're just going to work on getting him unmuted here, and then hopefully have him speak shortly here. So bear with us for just 1 second while we get Eric on the line. Hey, Eric, this is Max. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. Take it away.
Okay, so just so I know, how many speakers do you have left and how much time do you want me to speak for?
You got 10 minutes if you think you can do it.
Okay, yep, I think I can do that. So thanks for having me here today. I really appreciate it. I'm here to give an update on the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, commonly known as PDUFA. Do I have control over the slides, or? There we go. Just a quick overview of who we are at the National Health Council. We are a membership organization, primarily patient advocacy organizations. We have other members in membership as well, including representatives from the insurance, pharmaceutical, biotech, device, provider, other nonprofit communities. Our mission is to provide a united voice to people with chronic diseases and disabilities and their family caregivers. So I'm going to spend most of the time telling you where we are on PDUFA, but I just wanted to do a quick level set of some of the things that are included in the agreement. So by way of background, for those of you who don't know, Prescription Drug User Fee Act is an agreement between the FDA and the drug industry where they agree to pay fees for their drugs to be reviewed, and in response they get whatever is agreed to in the agreement. Primarily it's around quicker review times, but what's been really exciting over the last couple PDUFAs, they are reauthorized every 5 years, so 5 years ago, they really started moving into an area of bringing the patient voice into drug development and regulation. So what we see in this current PDUFA agreement is a call for a series of guidances to really help industry know what they can be doing, should be doing, how the FDA will interpret the information that they get when they go and speak to patients to learn what outcomes matter to them, their views on benefits and risks, their views on administration of drugs, really trying to make sure that products are more tailored towards the patients who will be using them. So over the course of 4 years, they'll be putting out a series of guidances that are focused on different areas, and we think this is really going to move the needle forward on bringing the patient perspective into the drug development process. A couple other things that we're really excited about in the agreement. Go to the next slide. Real-world evidence. I talked about this for those of you who were at the briefing that RDLA did on the Hill a couple months ago. Really excited to see that they're starting to set the stage to bring in new types of information outside of what's typically in a clinical trial. So looking at a variety of data sources such as from care settings, really trying to supplement and enhance clinical trials, which I think has a really good and strong impact, particularly in the rare disease community, where they may have a difficult time trying to fill out clinical trials because of the smaller patient populations. We think this is really exciting. They're taking some early steps into building out that science over the course of the next 5 years, and we'll be looking in the next agreement to kind of move that more into implementation. A couple other things that we're excited about, building upon the benefit risk framework that was included in the last agreement, really trying to bring more patient perspective into their benefit risk determinations, some regulatory science provisions related to biomarkers and surrogate endpoints, creating efficiencies for combination products that must be reviewed by the Drug and Device Center. Rare disease program, obviously really important to this community. One really exciting thing that they're doing in this agreement is taking the staff who work in the rare disease program and inserting them into the various review divisions. As you all know, the research and development and regulation of rare disease products is very different in a lot of ways. So making sure that people have expertise in rare diseases that are actually going to be reviewing the products, we think is going to really be a huge benefit for this community. There's also some provisions included around FDA hiring and retention, so they can have the scientific expertise that they need. So where are we now? So the Senate Health Committee marked up the user fees last week. They must approve what was agreed to by FDA and industry. A lot of times what you see is when this happens, a lot of other ideas and concepts get attached to the legislation as well. What the Senate did was a pretty clean reauthorization. They added a few things to the underlying bill around device inspection, device development for children. They have a pilot for setting devices after approval. So there's a couple things that are included in the bill. There were a few amendments that were addressed in the markup as well. They approved an amendment on speeding generic approval. They approved an amendment on clinical trials and looking at the inclusion and exclusion criteria. There's also some language there around expanded access. So that was included in the Senate version as well. They also had a vote on drug importation, which was tabled. So there's a few things that were added, a few things that were not. I think the real key thing is that it passed on pretty broad bipartisan basis. Only 2 senators voted against it, 1 from each party. So it remains a very nonpartisan, non-contentious idea, being the FDA user fees. The House, it says on the slide here that they'll be considering it soon. We now have a date since I sent these slides in, tomorrow. The Energy and Commerce Committee will be doing their work on marking up a bill. So we'll have to see what amendments they may be considering, if there's any changes that are made. I know the generic approval provision is something that they'll be considering tomorrow and probably has a very good likelihood of passing. But we're still kind of waiting to see what some of those other things might be. So once they clear that tomorrow, they'll go to the floor in both chambers. Unclear what the timing might look like for that at this point. We know that the Senate in particular has a pretty busy floor schedule, but we're hoping this will be done soon. Just as a reminder, these bills must be passed by September 30th. That's when the current authorization runs out. To add a caveat to that, their goal is really to get this done by the end of July before they leave town for August. Big reason for that is that if they don't get something approved, the FDA will have to start sending out layoff notices to staff. So their goal is to really get this through before they leave in August. And from all things that we're seeing, all things that we're hearing, it seems very likely that they will get that done. Just wanted to finish with one quick thank you to all of the organizations that are on the line or in the room that signed a letter that we circulated a couple weeks ago. We sent it up to Congress with over 120 organizations, really urging them to get this thing done as quickly as possible. So with that, I know I skipped over a lot of things. I was trying to be brief, but if we have any time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Eric. We do have time for maybe one or two questions. If folks have them, we can unmute the lines now, and you can also submit a question via the chat box. So yeah, ask away. This is your time to ask Eric any question you want about it.
Are you expecting it to go well in Energy and Commerce?
Yeah, I reached out to there this morning. It seems like they're expecting things to go fine. I think that some of the amendments that we saw in the Senate probably will not be considered, which I think will probably help with some of the contention. I would expect that this thing will get through. You know, it's typically been a very bipartisan, non-contentious bill, and from what I'm understanding, that'll continue. So.
Thank you.
Eric, this is Max. Just one question here. Have you heard anything? I mean, the administration waited on this. Just curious what their view is on this, if anything, at this point.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit, but I think this is a question about the administration and probably their talk about the user fee levels.
Well, just in general, their view on the agreement.
Yeah, so this has been really interesting. So this is the first time that a user fee has gone through that was negotiated by one administration and signed by another. So from the get-go, this has been very different, and obviously the administration is very different than many others as well. We have had some concerns and continue to do so in President Trump's skinny budget that was put out. So he called for the doubling of the user fees, and that was kind of hit with a thud once it got to Congress. So that's been something that they've been talking about. It was clear from the testimony by FDA staff that this administration has a different view on negotiation. So we also know that Secretary Price sent a letter to the Hill, I think earlier this week, late last week, saying that they want all of the drug reviews to be done by, funded by user fees. So we do have some concern there. At the end of the day, I don't think it's being very well received in Congress. They're going to get this through, send it up to the President. He's going to be forced to veto it. I don't know that that would happen, but I don't really make any predictions these days. So there is some concern there, and I think we're waiting to see what's going to come out in the President's budget next week. I think that'll be probably a stronger indication of what they might be thinking.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks for that update and for holding back on your predictions and for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Max.
Just want to mention one thing, too. Tomorrow's markup is just subcommittee, so it has to make it through subcommittee, and then it will go to full committee and then to the floor. So
very early in the process, even though they have to rush.
Great, thanks, Julia. So our next speaker is myself, going to be providing a quick update on where things stand with the Open Act. I'll provide a little bit of background on the legislation for those who might not be familiar with it, and then I'll go into where things are in terms of the state of play with Congress. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this slide because I think everyone on the call has an awareness of the scope of the innovation gap that exists around rare diseases. I think we all know that we have a huge problem in the current drug paradigm. The drug development paradigm has led to a lot of new treatments, but we still have quite a distance to go to get to the point in time where ideally all rare diseases actually have an FDA-approved treatment. For many rare disease patients, the standard of care is off-label, which for a variety of reasons is substandard care as far as we're concerned. We do think that rare disease patients deserve better. So you go to the next slide. So one solution, I'm not going to say this is going to solve all the problems, but one way that we're looking at addressing these types of issues is to get more therapies to patient FDA-approved therapies is actually by leveraging repurposing, which is a way of taking drugs that have already been developed and have already been in use on the market for one disease indication and actually testing them to see if they work in a rare disease indication as well. So the way we would incentivize companies to do that is actually by extending exclusivity for 6 months, which is a very modest extension, but we think it could be enough to really jumpstart efforts in the rare disease space, especially for repurposing. So that's what we'd like to see happen with the Open Act. If you go to the next slide here. And the reason why we think this is so important is this relatively small incentive could actually have a very big impact for rare disease patients. And really, once these repurposing trials start, we'll be able to accumulate a substantial amount of clinical data about rare diseases in terms of helping us understand the disease burden, but ideally transitioning some of those off-label therapies to actually on-label use. For many of you, I think you know that once something is on-label, it's much easier to get reimbursed. And even if we run a repurposing trial and it shows that it doesn't help that particular rare disease, that's also very important information for patients and for healthcare providers alike. So, even if the repurposing trial doesn't work, there's still some very beneficial and positive societal outcomes from that. And the other major benefit here is that these repurposed drugs, because many of those are already on the market for major market indications, they would be priced at that level too, which tends to be lower than the average price of an orphan drug. So basically our elevator pitch around this is that we think Open could help double the number of low-cost rare disease therapies available to patients. So that's really what we're trying to achieve and accomplish with the Open Act. So I should mention that the Open Act is actually modeled on something that is already law, and in fact, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act has been law for well over a decade, and the problem it was looking to address was that, at the time, and this is still true today to some degree, we had hundreds of drugs on the market, but very few of them had actually ever been tested in kids. So basically, the BPCA offered the same exact incentive that we are offering, the 6 months of exclusivity, and all that companies would need to do is initiate a trial in pediatrics to see if the drug was safe and effective. And just by initiating that trial, the company was eligible for the exclusivity extension. So with the Open Act, not only does the trial have to be initiated, but the FDA actually has to review the data and put that drug on label. So it's actually a higher standard that the sponsor would have to cross for the Open Act. But in the case of BPCA, I mean, this was extremely successful at generating data that for the first time ever was really telling doctors and healthcare providers and patients about what drugs were not only safe in kids, but were also effective. So very important piece of legislation. Go to the next slide, please. So getting back to the Open Act, the bill actually passed the House back when the House was considering one of the earlier iterations of 21st century cures. So it did pass the House back in July 2015, but it did not ultimately get through the Senate and into the final package that was signed into law. So as folks know, if your bill doesn't make it through, you have to start anew in the next Congress. And this year we did get a new Congress, so that means we have a new bill in the House, and the bill number is 1223. Very thankful for our original co-sponsors, Bill Rackus, Butterfield, and McCall, and we have several others, both Democrats and Republicans, who are also supporting the legislation. We are working on getting a Senate bill. We're hoping to see one soon, so definitely working hard on that front. Go to the next slide. So what we're trying to do is ideally get open included as part of the PDUFA package that's being considered. I don't need to define that because Eric did a really nice job giving an overview, and I think he basically covered the timelines here that both the Senate and the House have basically worked through parts of the committee component to the legislation, but we're not exactly sure about the timing of a floor vote. You know, it could be next week, it could be much later than that, so that's still up in the air, and as Eric mentioned, the Senate has quite a bit on its plate, especially with healthcare reform going on, but at the end of the day, this PDUFA agreement has to actually be signed, sealed, and delivered to the President by July 30th to avoid any potential disruptions at the FDA. Now, Congress could miss that deadline, but that would basically mean that those people working at FDA would actually get put on notice that you know, they might have to be furloughed or some negative outcome could happen if Congress and or the White House misses that deadline. So ideally, yeah, all of this would get wrapped up before the August recess. Next slide, please. So I do want to let folks know how they can help. I'm really excited and proud to report that over 220 patient organizations have signed on to endorse the OPEN Act, so very excited about that. I should also mention that yesterday, I'm sure many of you saw that we put out an action alert asking for folks to contact their representatives in the House and to ask them to actually co-sponsor the OPEN Act. So that's an active alert. It's online on our website. Definitely encourage folks to share that via email, to tweet it, and to put it up on Facebook. I should also say that, you know, in addition to those kind of mass action alert actions, you can also, for those who have relationships already with staffers in Congress, definitely email them, definitely, you know, tell them your personal story and let them know how OPEN could actually make an impact for you. And we're also starting to collect videos. We're looking for patients to submit very short, kind of 1-minute crisp videos that introduce themselves, where they're from, and talk a little bit about, you know, what it's like living with a rare disease or caring for someone who has a rare disease, and then you can submit that video to us, and we'll help promote it, and certainly encourage folks to share that video with their members of Congress as well. So if you guys have any questions about any of these, you can certainly email me. I think all of you have our email, and if you go to the next slide here, we've been putting as much as we possibly can up online. So the one-pager, some examples of videos, the action alert, all of that is available on our website. We've created a landing page that is really a clearinghouse for all things open. So would encourage you guys to check that out and please take action as soon as you're able to. So if you go to the next slide, I think this is my last slide here. Does anyone have any questions? You can submit them by the chat box, or Grant, if you can unmute the lines, we can hopefully get some questions from folks.
Max, we're losing people. If we could just move on really fast and then maybe do questions at the very end.
Okay.
So I'll go quickly over our programs. I mentioned this earlier to people in the room. We are doing advocacy training across the U.S. with Global Genes, one of our partners, trains patients on not only legislation, but really how to tell your own personal story, how to have a voice, whether you need that for awareness or for fundraising or building your own organization. Really helps patients in general. So if you're a patient organization and you want to really help activate your patient community, we just had our first conference in Atlanta Our next stop is Kansas City, actually the Missouri side, in June, and then we'll be in Portland, Oregon on July 15th. So we welcome everyone. They're free events, and it's just a great way to kind of build the grassroots community for the rare disease patients at the regional level. Next slide. We'll keep going. Next slide. Try to go through all of these. Keep going. There are travel stipends available for patients, just so if they're just small $100 stipends, so they can cover things for, you know, a patient needs a hotel or if there's any cost traveling. The other big event that's coming up that we're very excited, we actually have a coordinated fly out called In-District Lobby Days. We will help patients set meetings with their members of Congress in their local district. Registration will open on June 1st, and it is free for patients and caregivers and other rare disease advocates. You just sign up online. We'll do webinar training on the latest issues. We don't know what they will be yet because Congress can move quickly or slowly. But also we also help patients build their own one sheet. So if you had a specific issue that you wanted to activate Congress around, we help with that too. So next slide. A little bit about, you know, the goal of RDLA and the goal of our In-District Lobby Day program is really to strengthen those relationships, to build new relationships and strengthen existing relationships between members of Congress and rare disease patients. Next slide. So the dates are congressional recess, August 7th through September 6th. And we'll move on to the next slide. We'll have a webinar training. It's going to be July 28th. Next slide. Oh, my Gala slide didn't make it in, but I do have some flyers here. The Rare Voice Awards Gala is on November 15th. We are now accepting nominations. So if you have someone who has really been a voice in Capitol Hill or at the state government for rare disease patients, we encourage you to nominate them. We accept applications from federal agencies, so FDA, NIH, CDC, anyone that's been really gone out of their way to help rare disease patients and improve policy for rare disease patients. A congressional staffer who has gone above and beyond. This is one of the only events that really recognizes the important role of congressional staff, and they love this event. And we love honoring them and having them come back and be great advocates for us. For patients and patient organizations, we have state legislator, and category as well as state advocacy for patient or organization. And then new this year, we have teen advocacy. We really, and it likes to be called the young adults, but I'm old now, so I call them teens. But really want to encourage the next generation of rare disease advocates and really build that young adult teen advocacy. And we've got some amazing teen advocates, and they really deserve to be recognized. So please submit nominations. I have flyers here in the room. We could go to our Voice Awards for you who are on the line. But that's it. All right, I got through it really fast. Max, you can open up to questions now if there's still people on the line.
Yep, we still have over 60 people on the line, so we'll unmute the lines and folks can, again, submit questions using the chat box if they have any.
Max, I have a question on the Orphan Drug Act. If, in fact, there's a drug approved under Best Pharmaceuticals that gives for children the 6-month extension, as I read the proposed act, if it's approved under the orphan part, that there's an additional 6 months on top of the 6 months given under BPCA?
Yeah, so they do the study, it stacks on top of BPCA. So for rare pediatric diseases, it would be a full year. So.
And are you getting any pushback from Congress then that you're extending the exclusivity and the patent laws and keeping out the generic drug for either the 6 months or for a year? Is Congress giving you any pushback on that, or is it not keeping or not being able to reduce the price of drugs?
There are some concerns, especially with the Democrats on that, and it is one of, the reason why the rare disease patients who have nothing really need to be an activated voice in helping pass the legislation. But, if you have a non-controversial bill, it usually doesn't do much, right?
Thank Thank you.
Any other questions on the line?
Hey, Max, I have a question.
I heard part of the question, but could you speak up again, please?
Is there anything preventing, can you hear me? I'll just email you, no worries. It's hard to hear.
Any other questions out there? All right. Well, it sounds like we've talked your ears off today. So let me just say thank you and make a quick announcement. I think if you're watching the screen, you can see when our webinar is. So hope you guys all tune in to the presentation out next couple of weeks for that event. So I hope you guys can join. And let me say thank you to everyone who in the call today and everyone who listened in. Yeah, we'll see you guys next month. Take care, everyone.